welcome to your deep dive. Today we're going behind the scenes
Oh, cool.
with UK Council Environmental Health Officers.
Okay.
You'll see how they use nuisance law to tackle
Yeah.
those everyday environmental problems that can really make life miserable.
Right.
Ever had a neighbor who blasts music all night?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe you've been plagued by clouds of dust from a nearby construction site.
Yeah.
We're about to uncover the legal tools that can bring peace back to your neighborhood.
I love it.
Get ready for some surprising real-life cases, and who knows?
Yeah.
You might even pick up some tips for handling those pesky environmental issues yourself.
It's amazing how many people don't realize that there are actual laws in place to deal with things like noise, smells, and even light pollution.
Oh, yeah.
And the best part is you don't have to be a lawyer to understand them.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
Say you're an environmental health officer.
Yeah.
And a resident comes to you utterly exasperated because their neighbor's garden has basically turned into an illegal dumping ground.
I've seen that.
Where do you even begin?
What's fascinating is that dealing with illegally dumped waste,
Yeah.
it doesn't require navigating a maze of environmental permits.
Okay.
The Environmental Protection Act of 1990, specifically Section 33, is your go-to weapon.
Okay.
It makes dumping controlled waste on any land without a license
Right.
a straight-up offense.
Oh, wow.
That means you, as the officer, have immediate power to act.
So no waiting for permits or endless paperwork?
Right.
You could just march over there and tell them to clear it up.
Pretty much.
Wow.
Think of that case a few years back, and
Yeah.
remember the one where a company was caught red-handed dumping medical waste?
Oh, yeah.
Section 33 was used to shut them down immediately and force a complete cleanup.
Wow.
It's about protecting public health and making sure those responsible are held accountable.
That's a relief.
Yeah.
Knowing there's a system in place to handle these situations definitely gives you a sense of empowerment.
It does.
But what about noise complaints?
Oh, yeah.
Those seem to be a constant issue,
Right?
especially in densely populated areas.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Noise is a major factor in quality of life.
Right.
And the good news is it's also covered under the Environmental Protection Act of 1990.
Okay.
Section 79 defines noise as a statutory nuisance.
Okay.
If it's deemed unreasonable and significantly interferes with someone's enjoyment of their property.
So imagine it's 3 a.m.
Yeah?
and you're jolted awake by the ear-splitting roar of a construction site next door.
Uh-huh.
Does that mean you can call the council
Yeah.
and demand they shut down the entire operation?
Well, it's not quite as simple as that,
Right.
but you're on the right track.
Okay.
The council's environmental health officer would investigate the complaint,
Okay.
measure the noise levels, and assess whether it constitutes a statutory nuisance.
Yeah.
If it does, they can issue an abatement notice to the construction company.
An abatement notice.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty serious.
It is.
What exactly does that entail?
It's a legal order that requires the company to stop or reduce the nuisance.
Oh, okay.
That might mean restricting noisy activities to certain times,
Yeah.
using quieter equipment, or even putting up noise barriers.
So it's not just a slap on the wrist.
Oh, no.
There are real consequences for ignoring it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Ignoring an abatement notice can lead to hefty fines.
Right.
And if they persist, the council can even take them to court.
Really?
In extreme cases, they might be forced to halt their operations completely.
Wow.
The law provides real teeth to ensure residents get the peace and quiet they deserve.
That's reassuring to know.
Yeah.
It's not just empty words. There's a mechanism for real action.
Exactly.
Now, what about those situations where it's not so much the noise, but rather the smell
Right.
or dust coming from, let's say, an industrial site?
Excellent point.
Yeah.
The Environmental Protection Act is pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
Dust and fumes also fall under the definition of statutory nuisances.
In Section 79,
Right.
imagine you live downwind from a factory
Oh, yeah.
that constantly releases foul smells or clouds of dust.
Yeah.
It's not just unpleasant. It can actually impact your health.
So just like with the noise complaint,
Right.
an environmental health officer would investigate and assess the situation. If the dust or fumes are causing harm or exceeding reasonable levels, they can issue an abatement notice.
Precisely.
Okay.
The abatement notice would be tailored to the specific problem.
Right.
It might require the factory to install filters,
Yeah.
change their processes, or even limit certain activities during sensitive times.
It sounds like the environmental health officer needs to be a bit of a detective,
Yes.
piecing together the evidence
Uh-huh.
and using the right legal tool for each situation.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
They need to be thorough, observant, and understand the nuances of each case.
This is already incredibly insightful.
It feels like we're getting a crash course in environmental law enforcement.
Is.
But before we get carried away,
Okay.
let's pause here for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure our listeners are already feeling more informed.
Agreed.
Yeah.
We've only just scratched the surface.
Right.
But hopefully this gives you a sense of the power and importance of nuisance law in protecting our environment and quality of life.
For sure.
But don't go anywhere.
Okay.
We've got plenty more fascinating cases and legal insights to explore.
Sounds good.
All right. We'll be back.
We'll be back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of UK environmental health officers and their trusty sidekick nuisance law.
That's right.
We've already seen how they tackle illegal dumping and noise.
Right.
But believe me, their toolbox is packed with even more legal tricks to handle those pesky environmental problems.
It's true. We've only just begun to explore the fascinating ways environmental health officers can use the law to protect our communities and the environment. Okay, so we've tackled the noisy neighbor and the fly-tipping fiend.
Right.
What other scenarios might an environmental health officer encounter?
Let's shift gears and imagine a seemingly quiet residential street where an old factory site has been redeveloped into shiny new apartments.
Okay.
Everything seems great until residents start complaining of strange smells,
Oh, no.
health problems, and even discolored soil in their gardens.
Oh.
Turns out the ground beneath those fancy new homes is contaminated with hazardous substances from the site's industrial past.
That sounds like a real nightmare scenario.
It can be.
You think you're moving into your dream home and suddenly you're living on top of a toxic time bomb? What can be done in a situation like that?
This is where Part III of the Environmental Protection Act comes into play.
Okay.
It's specifically designed to deal with contaminated land and protect human health and the environment from the legacy of industrial activity.
So it's not just about dealing with current pollution.
Oh.
It's about addressing the sins of the past.
No. Exactly. The local authority has a duty to actively inspect their area for contaminated land.
Wow.
Regardless of whether residents have reported anything.
So they're not just waiting for complaints to roll in.
No.
They're proactively looking for potential hazards.
Absolutely. And if they discover contaminated land, they have the power to issue something called a remediation notice.
The remediation notice.
Yeah.
This notice is served on the appropriate person who is responsible for cleaning up the mess.
Right.
Appropriate person. That sounds a bit vague.
It can be.
Who exactly are they pointing the finger at?
Well, the Act sets out a hierarchy of responsibility, and it can get a bit complicated.
Right.
Ideally, they'll go after the person or company who caused the contamination in the first place.
So if they can prove that a specific company dumped toxic waste on the site 20 years ago, that company is on the hook for cleaning it up, even if they don't own the land anymore.
You got it.
Wow.
However, if that culprit can't be found or they've gone out of business, the responsibility can shift to the current owner of the land.
Hold on. So even if you had nothing to do with the contamination, you could still end up footing the bill for the cleanup just because you happen to own the land now.
Unfortunately, that's a possibility.
Oh, yeah.
That's why it's absolutely crucial to conduct thorough environmental due diligence before purchasing any property.
Okay.
Especially if it has a history of industrial use.
Right.
You don't want to inherit someone else's environmental mess along with their property.
This all sounds incredibly expensive.
It can be.
Who ultimately pays for the remediation work?
That's where the polluter pays principle comes in.
Okay.
It's a core concept in environmental law.
Right.
And it means that whoever is responsible for the contamination is ultimately responsible for paying for the cleanup.
But as we've just discussed, sometimes the original polluter is long gone or impossible to track down.
Right.
What happens in those cases?
That's a real challenge in those situations. The current landowner might be stuck with a hefty bill.
Oh, no.
Even though they didn't cause the problem.
Yeah.
There are some limited exceptions.
Okay.
But often the financial burden falls on them.
It seems incredibly unfair that someone could be forced to pay for a mess they didn't create.
It definitely raises questions of fairness, and there have been countless debates about how to address this issue.
Right.
Some argue for a government fund to assist innocent landowners, while others believe in strictly adhering to the polluter pays principle, even if it means hardship for the current owner. So there's no easy answer. It's a complex issue with both ethical and economic dimensions.
Exactly.
But at least the Environmental Protection Act provides a framework for identifying and addressing these contaminated sites.
Yes.
Even if the process isn't always perfectly smooth.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Right.
We're not just looking at laws in isolation.
Yeah.
We're exploring how they play out in the real world and grappling with the challenges they present.
It's about understanding the complexities and nuances of environmental law in action.
This is truly eye-opening.
Yeah.
I bet our listeners are now seriously rethinking buying that old factory site they had their eye on.
I hope so.
It's a reminder that what lies beneath the surface can be just as important as what you see above ground.
It really can.
Hopefully they'll be doing their research before signing any contracts.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to address one crucial question.
Yeah.
What happens if those responsible for contamination simply ignore the remediation notice?
That's a great point. We've talked about the law and the procedures.
Right.
But what about enforcement? Are there any real consequences for those who disregard these notices?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Ignoring a remediation notice is a serious offense.
Okay.
Just like ignoring an abatement notice for noise or waste can lead to substantial fines, and the local authority even has the power to step in and carry out the remediation work themselves.
So they don't just issue a piece of paper and hope for the best.
Nope.
They're willing to get their hands dirty, so to speak, and make sure the problem is addressed, even if it means taking on the cleanup themselves.
You got it. And after they've cleaned up the mess, they can then bill the responsible person for the costs.
Wow, that's great.
So there are real consequences for noncompliance. It's not just about punishment.
Right.
It's about ensuring these environmental issues are addressed and the law is respected.
This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Our listener must be feeling empowered with a new understanding of their rights.
Hopefully.
And the tools available to them.
Yeah.
We've gone from noisy neighbors to toxic land.
And
it's clear that the UK takes environmental protection seriously.
they do.
But before we send our listener off to conquer the world of environmental justice, let's take a moment to digest all this information.
Agreed. We've covered a lot of ground today, and it's important to let these insights sink in. But there's still more to discover, so stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll unravel even more fascinating cases and legal tools.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the world of UK environmental health officers and nuisance law.
Okay.
We've uncovered how they tackle everything from overflowing bins to contaminated land.
It's a lot.
But there's one more area I'm itching to explore.
Okay.
The fascinating and sometimes controversial realm of genetically modified organisms.
Oh, yes. GMOs, a topic that always sparks debate.
Right.
But how does nuisance law fit into this complex picture?
That's exactly what I'm hoping you can shed some light on.
Okay.
Imagine a scenario where, let's say a research facility is conducting experiments with a genetically modified crop. And some of those seeds accidentally escape into the environment.
Right.
Would that be considered a nuisance under UK law?
That's a great question, and it highlights the intricate nature of environmental law.
Yep.
While the release of GMOs could have significant environmental consequences, it's not directly addressed under the nuisance framework we've been discussing.
Okay.
Instead, GMOs have their own dedicated section within the Environmental Protection Act.
Right.
Part 6, to be exact.
So it's not as simple as slapping an abatement notice on a rogue GMO.
Not quite.
Okay.
GMOs are treated differently because of the unique risks they pose to biodiversity and the delicate balance of ecosystems.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Part 6 of the Act establishes a system of consents and controls for every stage of working with GMOs, from import and acquisition to keeping release and even marketing.
It sounds like they've really thought this through.
They have.
Recognizing that GMOs require a specialized approach.
Absolutely. The focus is on carefully managing risks and ensuring that any activity involving GMOs is carried out with the highest level of responsibility.
So let's go back to that scenario of the escaped GMO seeds.
Okay.
If that happened unintentionally, would the research facility be in trouble?
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
Part 6 requires anyone working with GMOs to obtain consent from the Secretary of State before carrying out any activities that could lead to their release.
All right.
If the release was unintentional and the facility didn't have the necessary consent, they could face enforcement action.
And what kind of action are we talking about here?
Right.
Would it be similar to the abatement notices we discussed earlier?
The enforcement mechanisms under Part 6 are a bit different.
Okay.
Instead of abatement notices,
Right.
the Secretary of State can issue enforcement notices that require the facility to take specific steps to mitigate the risks posed by the released GMO.
Right.
They can also revoke consents,
Oh, wow.
impose fines, and even pursue criminal prosecution in certain cases.
So while it might not fall under the traditional definition of nuisance,
Right.
the accidental release of a GMO is taken very seriously.
It is.
There are robust legal mechanisms in place.
Yes.
To prevent it and address any consequences.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the potential impact of GMOs on the environment.
Right.
And having a legal framework that prioritizes caution and responsibility.
Wow, this deep dive has really illuminated the vast scope of environmental legislation in the UK.
It has.
We've journeyed from the basics of noise and waste to the complexities of contaminated land and even the world of GMOs.
That's right.
It's been an incredible exploration of how the law can be used to protect our environment and public health.
And I hope our listener is walking away not only with a deeper understanding of these laws, but also a sense of empowerment.
For sure.
Knowing your rights and the tools available to address environmental concerns is the first step towards making a positive difference in your community.
Absolutely. Understanding the law is just the beginning.
Yeah.
It's what we do with that knowledge that truly counts.
That's true.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
I
want to leave our listener with a final thought to ponder. Could aspects of UK nuisance law, with its focus on practicality and community well-being, be applied to environmental issues in other parts of the world? It's a question worth considering.
Definitely.
As you continue your own exploration of environmental law and justice.
That's a good one.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into nuisance law in the UK.
Thanks for having me.